4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for the Houston React Developers Meetup. My name is Tracy. I will be the facilitator for the event tonight, and we also have Nick, who will be managing all incoming comments. And we also have Fabian, who is a co-organizer for the group. I should say the organizer for our group. But tonight's topic is coding a domain model with Aidan. And just to give everyone a heads up, as the presentation is taking place, please feel free to leave any questions in the chat. Nick will manage all questions to be answered by Aidan at the end of this presentation. Really quick, before we get started, at some point we'll share a link with everyone, but Houston React developers want to hear from you. We do have a 1-question survey. I'll be sure to get Nick the link so he can share it with the chat. Just share with us any topics that you would like the group to cover in the upcoming meets. And also, if you're interested in presenting in the same survey, you can leave us your contact information so that we can get a hold of you in order for you to present. So everyone in this group, please put yourself on mute and go ahead and hide your screens. We're going to give Aidan the floor. Aidan, when you are done, just give us a heads up that you're done presenting, and then I will take back over to facilitate. So take it away.
Will do. Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate it. So hello, everybody. I'd like to talk to you today about the domain model. There's a concept that you might have heard of in the past called domain-driven design. And if you haven't, we'll cover that a little bit today. So what we'll talk about today is, first of all, who am I? Why should you listen to me? What is the domain model? Why is it important? How can it be implemented? And then we'll have some time at the end for questions. So as far as who am I? My name is Aidan Garza. I was principal engineer at Homeward for a couple of years. Homeward is my 5th startup. Now I'm in more of an engineering management role. And I've been building React apps since version 0.7 when I built an internet banking platform. And I'll mention that we're hiring. Here's my LinkedIn profile and my email address. Feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. I'd love to meet anybody and answer questions. Every connection's a good connection. So what is a domain model? And the simplest answer for that is it's the nouns in an application, and it can also encompass their relationships. So, I'm building an app. It's got users. It might have accounts. Maybe I'm using addresses or vehicles or to-dos. Whatever the actual things in my application. The words that I'm using to describe the things in my application, that is the domain of my application. And typically, when you're working on an app, when we're designing an app, we'll kind of represent the domain model by a class diagram. You could also see like entity diagrams or actor diagrams. But typically, you capture it with class diagrams or even things that are even simpler than class diagrams. So as an example, let's take this to-do list app here. We've got a to-do list, and it looks like there's an opportunity to add more lists, and that list has some items in it, and then those items have labels. So the domain model could be as simple as this. We've got lists, and lists contain items, and items are attached to labels, and then the relationships between them have names too. So an item that belongs to a list can be a list item. Label that belongs to an item can be an item label. And now we've got like a set of nouns, a set of words that anybody working on the app and anybody around the app or using the app can use. And when you say them, we know what you're talking about. So for this app, this was my last startup, Ideal Spot. Its domain model was a lot bigger than the one that we just saw. And I made it a point to always keep this diagram up to date, and so that everybody knew how to refer to things in our app and what the relationships look like. So some key things to remember about a domain model is it's not set in stone. It's a very iterative thing. Like we're constantly updating it and refactoring it as our understanding of the space that we're working in evolves and improves and grows and changes. So when when I'm building a banking platform, I've got transactions maybe, and then at some point I realize that transactions should have categories. So now that new transaction category concept has entered my domain. And as you add features and as you understand your area better, your domain model will change. So for example, back to this to-do concept, if we've got, before we had these three main objects and two relationships. So what if we decided that our users really wanted specific groups of labels to apply to a list? Well, then we might add the concept of a label group. And that would come with the new concept of a list label group. And, these words, the point of maintaining this is that as we're developing our app, again, we've got one set of words and one set of relationships that everybody can look at and know what's going on in the application. So let's get into that a little more. Why is it important to have a domain model for your app, and to think about your application from a domain-driven perspective, like understanding what your app is actually affecting in the real world? And yeah, for right off the bat, a domain model is a vital link between the real world and the code. It's those actual words. Like when you're making a banking app, a transaction is a real thing that happens, and a user is a real person. And being able to use those words confidently and know what a specific word is referring to in your application really helps you to understand how your software is affecting the real world. And beyond that, it provides a common vocabulary for your team, so that you can work more efficiently, you can communicate more effectively. If your front end team, if the client side application has a concept called an estimate, and the back end systems call it pricing, and the design team is referring to it as a quote, and even if you're involved at the design period, that's confusing, because one person says one word and you have to have this translation to another system. Whereas if everybody just calls it an estimate or everybody calls it a quote, then when the design team is looking at the client side code and when the back end is working out a contract with the front end and you use that word, you all know what you're talking about. So by removing all of the translation that has to happen by just using the common vocabulary, you can be a lot more efficient and effective and get work done a lot faster. And beyond that, when you don't have all of those mappings between words, you're reducing tribal knowledge, so that anytime you have a new engineer join your team, or a new designer, or anybody, product manager, when anybody joins your team, they can look at this one list of nouns and look at any system and know what it's referring to, rather than having to search across a bunch of different words. And that also leads to better maintainability for the same reason. When you make an update to a domain item on one system, you know that you have to make corresponding updates on another system to that same type of object. And then it's also a highly visual and understandable concept by both technical and non-technical teams. So if you have, if you've coded your domain model into your app and you have it, representation of that, in a class diagram or some other kind of visual representation of the domain, you can show that to both technical people, new technical people joining your team, or maybe outside. Say you have to integrate with a third-party system, you can show them, hey, here's our domain model. How do our objects correspond to the objects in your system so that we can integrate together, or even non-technical teams like you've got a business team that needs some new feature and they need it today and don't understand why it can't happen, and you can show them your domain model and say, hey, what you're asking for is that we connect this thing on this side over to this thing on that side, and see how far apart they are. That's not an easy thing to do. And it just can communicate so much about the structure of your application with very little amount of space and with a high level of understandability. So I've talked a lot about what it is and why it's important, but when it comes to React applications, how can we actually implement it? How can we think about building a React application from a domain-driven perspective? And like I said, Homeward is now my 5th startup, and in the last 3 startups I've been with, I've used a system in React and Vue that did exactly this, that took a domain-driven perspective and made the domain model a first-class citizen of my applications. So how can we turn this, and we're going to be looking specifically at this like to-do list concept, how can we turn this domain model into code that maps back to it explicitly? So the code that we'll be looking at is in GitHub, called to-do domain model. Here it is right here. And this is the app from the slide earlier that we'll actually be looking at. So very simple. There's lists. You can make more lists. The lists have items. Those items can have labels. You can mark the items as complete. So we can spin up a whole new list that's, party supplies. And let's add pizza. And let's add cake. And after I bought them, I can mark them as done. And we can add labels to them potentially. So maybe pizza is a deli item and this is a bakery item. There we go. So this is a very simple application. It's got very few mechanics, but we've got these 3 main concepts: these lists, the items within the lists, and then these labels. So let's go look at the code for this particular app. And I have kind of 3 core principles that I kind of want to go over when it comes to implementing the domain model as a primary concept in your application. So the first of those is create a class for each domain model element in a root models directory. So I know, in React, we've been moving away from classes. We've been moving towards functional components and hooks. And in a lot of ways, classes can be kind of aversive to people. But I'm thinking about this in a very simple way. We're not going full on object-oriented development here. We're just creating a list of things that we can identify individually that correspond to our domain. So let's see what that looks like. So here in my source directory, I've got a models directory, just like I mentioned in that slide. And in that models directory, I have 3 files. I've got item, label, and list, just like in my domain model. So let's take a look at what the list class looks like. So over time, I've kind of compiled a lot of things, not a lot of things, but a few core things together into this concept. And we won't go over all of it today, because really I'm just hoping to get at the core concept of just having these classes and primarily having the classes with the correct names. So we've got a list item in our domain model. So we've got a list class, and that list item in our domain model has 2 properties. It has an ID and a name. And when we were actually interacting with that item, so here's our list and here's its name, and it has an ID that corresponds, a unique ID in our database so that we can attach things to it. So very straightforward. We don't need anything else in here, really. This is all just kind of nice. And if anybody has questions about why I like to put the actual API definitions and things like the ability to create a static instance, we can definitely talk about that outside of the context of this presentation. But really, I could put a curly brace right here and end the definition of the class there, and this would be enough to get across what I'm hoping to in this presentation. So, so yeah, we've got our list concept with an ID and a name. We've got our item concept that has an ID, a name, a list of label names, a flag for whether or not it's complete, and then a list ID for the list that it's actually assigned to. And then we've got our label concept, where we've got a label has a name and a color. And there you go. Anybody who's brand new to this application, I could hire a new junior front-end developer tomorrow, and they could come in and look at this application, and I could say, hey, go open the models directory, and that will tell you all of the things that we interact with in our app. And there they have it. And they know exactly what the objects they're going to be interacting with are, what they're called. If they need to talk to a backend engineer about, hey, what's going on with labels? Is there anything special I need to know? They can say the word label, and the backend team can tell them exactly what they need to know, because they use the word label too. So that is the model concept. And there's a couple of cool things about this that we'll talk more about in a second. But for starters, just know that this isn't something you have to have from the beginning. You can totally retrofit this in. You don't even have to use these yet. Just start building your list and start documenting what they should look like, or what the content of those objects are. And that already is a huge win for your project. So that was the first the first of three concepts. The second is, now that you've got your models, you've got those names, try your very best, and it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard, but try your very best to maintain consistent naming for components, for functions, for Redux stores, for context, anything that has to do with your domain model. Try and name it so that the name corresponds with the things in your domain model. I know that it's definitely difficult, and it's always going to be hard, but naming things is important. The better you can name things, and the closer that naming of anything in your app corresponds to your domain model, the easier it's going to be to maintain, the easier it's going to be to explain to new people that are joining, and the more understandable it'll be in general. So this particular project was built with the Create React App ReactJS toolkit template, and that comes pre-configured with this nice concept of features. So you don't have to use this. You can use whatever organization structure you like. I particularly like it for small applications, especially. But in this case, we've got features. Our three domain items are individual features within this application. So we've got lists, items, and labels, just like we had in our models and in our domain class diagram. And when we look within these directories, everything has consistent naming. There's a store, a Redux toolkit slice here called list slice for lists, and labels slice for labels, and item slice for items. And I know exactly what that's talking about. And if you're not familiar with ReactJS toolkit, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's an amazing library that's very well maintained, and definitely makes working with reducers of any kind, Redux for Redux purposes, or context and provider relationships. It's fantastic. Definitely check it out. But if I look in here, so let's take a look at labels. It's kind of the simplest concept we have. So I've got a label slice. I've got some components, and those components tell me what I'm dealing with. So I've got a label pill. That is the this actual little pill component for a label. I know exactly what it's doing. A label picker. So I might might need to look at where that's actually being used, but pretty quickly I can tell that, oh, it's talking about this. Or item labels. So in this case, I'm taking an item, I'm taking an individual item, and I'm listing out the label pills for the labels that are associated with that item. So again, it took so much less effort to read the names of those components and tell basically what they were doing just from the name, because we're following this domain-centric naming convention. So that's part two, is when you're building things associated with your domain model, be they components, or if you're in Next.js pages, or if you're using Redux, stores, or if you're using context provider patterns, reducers, or pieces of context. If you name those things consistently with your domain model, it's so much easier to tell what things are referring to. And finally, a last piece, and this one is very much optional, because if you're using TypeScript, you don't necessarily need this. If you're using TypeScript in your app, you can kind of already get this domain. You can work out the same kind of domain concept with interfaces and with types, and that's great. And so if your project is using TypeScript, I highly recommend making sure that all of your interfaces and your types and your shapes are corresponding to items in your domain and named accordingly. And that, again, anything that's using those is also named likewise. So TypeScript is a great way of enforcing the same kind of domain-driven concept. But if you're not using TypeScript and you're using prop types instead, then a really cool thing about having an actual class instance for every item in your domain is that you can use instance of checks for prop validation. So, I remember in the distant past having shapes of objects all over the place in prop validation. And since I've had these domain model classes, let's go back and look right here at this item labels component. It takes a prop called item, which I would expect to be an item because we're naming things in a understandable way. And in the prop types for item labels, say item, and it's an instance of my item class from my models directory. And that tells me everything I need to know. That item is going to have all the properties that I expect an item to have. So I don't need to worry about any checking on, does item.label names exist, and does label.name exist? I don't have to do any conditional checking for those properties because they're there purely because it's an instance of an item. And then beyond that, if there's any custom class methods that I've decided to add, like say, if a label if we wanted to do something like a display name, so we could do an easy get display name and have that return label with then this name. There we go. So we've got, if there's things like this that we need to do, we can do them in one place in the class model, and they'll instantly be available in every location that we're interacting with that domain entity, which is really great. And this has come in handy so many times in my applications where, the backend has added one new property, because we needed to add a flag or some metadata, or we've been using user first name, last name, and then there's all kinds of places where we want to put them together. And you just make that change in one place, and now by virtue of it being a class and being able to check the instance, you now know that you have that everywhere where you're using it. So that's the third suggestion when you're thinking about a React app with a domain-driven perspective. So let's go over those one more time. The first thing I recommend is creating a class for each element in your domain model and putting that in your source directory. So source/models list out every noun that you interact with in your application and the properties that you expect that item to have, because it makes it so much easier to understand what all your app is interacting with and gives you a common vocabulary with the rest of your team. Second, now that you've got that list of nouns, use those nouns everywhere that you're interacting with those objects, because that's going to make it easier to understand what everything's doing, and easier to search for things, and easier to understand for new people joining. And finally, if you're using TypeScript, make sure that TypeScript is encapsulating this domain model in your interfaces and types and shapes, and that those two things are going together. And if you're not using TypeScript, definitely take advantage of the fact that you can do instance of checks against these class types to make sure that you can trust the data that's being passed around your app to have the properties that you expect it to have and to conform with your domain model. So that is the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Nick, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we actually got one from Fabian. So he has a question. In what phase of the development cycle, discover, design, development, etc., is the domain model updated? Is it maintained by like a single individual, committee, product team?
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's maintained by the entire organization, really. Like, but changes are made to the domain model in code as you're actually, writing code. So any new story or new epic that you have that introduces a new entity or makes a change to an entity should be responsible for making sure that your domain model is up to date. So it's really just kind of a shared discipline thing. As long as it's part of your culture to keep it updated, it stays updated as changes are actually made.
And then we have one also by Nacho. He said he'd like to hear more about like the API and the model. I don't know if you could explain it, I guess, a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah, sure. So I personally like to, I mean, when you think about it, like if you're dealing with a RESTful backend with your React app, then that RESTful backend is going to have these exact same terms, these exact same concepts. So it's so easy if you're all using the same language to encapsulate that RESTful backend, those RESTful backend endpoints, along with the model that they're interacting with. So in this case, we've got our items. So I've got some Firebase base URL, and I've got a slash items endpoint, and it has a get endpoint and a post endpoint for creating, and a put for updating, and a delete endpoint. And by putting all of those here, so let's look at a place where these are actually being used. So I personally use this concept called use API. I'm really starting to come around to the React query, and I might wind up switching to that at some point. But I've been using this hook called use API, and I can basically just pass that function that we just saw from item. That ultimately what this is doing is defining a query. So this particular one is, I'm using the fetch API in this project, but I've also done this with Axios or anything else. I'm defining a config for making an HTTP request with a URL and a method and a body and perhaps credentials or headers, and then it just feeds right into this hook. That I feed that function into the hook, and when I need to make the request, it creates the request and sends it off. So yeah, it's just been a really nice way. Again, I'm making sure that my domain model is complete, and that I'm encoding my contract between my client app and the backend into this domain model, because that's exactly what an API is. It's I know that I'm using the same words as the back end, and that when I make a request here, I'm getting back an object that looks like this. So yeah, I'm happy to go into even more detail on that after the fact, or I can even like I've been planning on writing a blog post on it. But yeah, that's what I've been doing there for a while now.
Awesome, thank you. We don't have any more questions in the chat, but I didn't know if anybody on the team had any questions. Fabian or Tracy, if y'all have any. But if not, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Tracy.
Is that all right if I just give one little closing statement?
Go for it.
Awesome. Yeah, so as I mentioned at the beginning, Homeward is hiring. I've got some open roles for senior React engineers. We also have senior backend roles and data engineer positions open. We raised a $371 million Series B this past May. So we're growing like crazy. We're working on some really, really cool tech for improving the home buying process. So again, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email at aidan@homeward.com if you'd like to apply or learn more about the company.
Okay, awesome. Thank you again, Aidan. That was excellent. We really appreciate you joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge with the group. And I'm sure everyone feels the same way when I say we would love to have you speak again sometime on any other topic. That was awesome. But for the viewers, we will have this recording up on Houston React Developers YouTube channel as soon as it's available. And thank you again, and everybody have an awesome night.
That was an awesome presentation, Aidan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.